Have you ever heard of a battle where even the most feared army in the world shook to its core? Where Alexander, history's great conqueror, was halted before an enemy that no war manual had ever prepared for? That's right. Sometimes the greatest challenge doesn't come clad in shining armor with a sword in hand. Sometimes it comes with giant tusks, thick skin, and a trunk that drags everything in its path. The truth is, the Battle of the Hydaspes was a turning point, literally. A clash where the man who had conquered the Persian Empire encountered a new kind of terror, war elephants, more than 200 of them. And if you think Alexander brushed past that with ease, get ready to have your notions challenged. Because on that day, the legend nearly turned into a tragic story. But here's the twist. What seemed like the end became the pinnacle of tactical genius. Instead of brute force, Alexander used intelligence, cunning, and a situational awareness that still leaves strategists in awe today. And more than that, this encounter defined the zenith of his empire and the beginning of his retreat. Yes, the man who always wanted to press forward had to consider pulling back that day. And the reason? It's more human than you might imagine. If you want to understand how this battle redefined the limits of ambition, courage, and leadership itself, then come with me. Because what happened at the Hydaspes wasn't just war. It was a lesson in eternity. They say that traversing the world requires more than courage. And Alexander, the one they call the Great, wasn't just brave. He was driven by an almost sacred hunger to go further. After shattering the Persian Empire, he set his sights eastward, toward an unknown, humid land where rains don't ask for permission and the Hydaspes River overflows as if to swallow any invader. But Alexander wasn't a man to back down from raging waters or proud kings. He wanted to leave a mark where no one dared to tread. With his feet sinking into the mud and the skies unleashing storms, the Macedonian army followed their leader as if trailing a prophet. Eastern India was a mystery wrapped in lightning, jungles, and whispers of formidable kings. But Alexander the Great didn't see monsters. He saw opportunity. And even though the Hydaspes roared like an untamable dragon, he saw it as a bridge to glory. It was more than a river. It was a test, one that only the immortal dare face. On the opposite bank, the mighty King Porus waited, and he was no ordinary man. He was respected, feared, and, an important detail, possessed a weapon that would send shivers down Alexander's men's spines: war elephants. Huge, unknown creatures, noisy as living thunder. But that was just another spice in the challenge. Alexander knew either he conquered at the Hydaspes or his legend would end there, drowned in the mud. It's funny to think that even after so many victories, Alexander kept risking everything. There was no comfort zone for him. He threw himself into the abyss, hoping and trusting that he would find solid ground amid the fall. And now, on the banks of the Hydaspes, he was preparing one of the boldest plans of his life. A plan where brains had to be sharper than the sword. The rain fell, the elephants grumbled, and Alexander smiled. Because he knew that every great empire begins with a crossing. And in the heart of that humid night, under the thunder and mystery of the Orient, Alexander the Great was gearing up to face something unprecedented. But what he and his men didn't yet know was that the real surprise would come with the roar of trunks at dawn. Porus was more than a king. He was practically a living wall between Alexander and the unknown. A haughty man of legendary stature who rode elephants as if they were mere horses. And speaking of which, these elephants weren't circus animals, no. They were rolling tanks with natural armor, decorated tusks, and eyes that blended fury with obedience. Imagine the shock of the Macedonian soldiers when they spotted over 200 of these monsters lined up, ready to crush anything that moved. No one in Alexander the Great's army had ever seen anything like it. Horses reared up at the mere whiff of these beasts, Soldiers exchanged glances, murmuring like children in the face of thunder. But is that even possible? The Hydaspes was already a significant challenge, but now there was a wall of muscle, ivory, and trunks waiting on the other side. And Porus, as calm as a monk, knew the power of psychological impact. He wanted Alexander to feel fear even before the fight began. The truth is, war elephants were a weapon that combined physical might with emotional terror. They advanced like storms with legs. Ordinary spears couldn't penetrate their thick skin, and Macedonian shields turned to flimsy cardboard under their feet. Porus had arranged his infantry in perfect harmony with these beasts, like a maestro conducting chaos. He knew that if he made the enemies hesitate for even a second, that second would be enough. But Alexander was no ordinary man. When his officers suggested a retreat, he simply laughed. This was the kind of challenge he craved, the sort that demanded more brain than brawn. Still, he knew that the impact of the elephants couldn't be underestimated. It was as if the gods had sent mythical creatures to test him. And when he looked at that gigantic force led by Porus, he understood. The Hydaspes wouldn't be an ordinary battle. It would be a turning point, literally. And amid all that chaos, one question pounded in everyone's mind. How do you defeat something you don't even understand? Alexander knew he needed an answer soon, because with every step he took toward the Hydaspes, the sound of drums and trunks grew louder, and the only way to defeat a nightmare was to face it head-on. While Porus bolstered his confidence on the Hydaspes banks, expecting Alexander to charge in head-on like any traditional general, the young Macedonian king was devising something entirely different. Alexander the Great knew that beating brute force with brute force wasn't smart warfare, so he did what few leaders would dare. He used the river itself as an ally. He made it seem like he would attack head-on, right in the middle of the morass. But behind the ruse lay the real plan. On a night soaked with lightning and uncertainty, Alexander gathered a select group of soldiers, the fastest, quietest, and most reliable. They slipped away, marching upstream far from the enemy's eyes. It was as if they were touching the tip of the unknown with their own fingers. There were no guarantees, only faith. Faith in their leader, faith in the strategy, faith that, at dawn, the Hydaspes wouldn't be a graveyard, but a bridge to eternity. The scene was almost cinematic. Thunder shaking the sky, wind cutting through flesh, and men crossing the river with water in their chests, holding their spears high above their heads. It was there that the legend was born. Alexander led personally, drenched to the bone, yet with the steely gaze of someone who saw beyond the fog. The crossing was an enormous risk. One mistake, and everyone would be swallowed by the current or discovered by Porus's spies. But the night's silence was complicit when the sun finally peeked over the horizon. The surprise was devastating. Porus turned and saw the impossible. Alexander the Great was already on the other side, in an attacking position, ready to crush his flank. It was like a chess move, where the king moves like a knight, unexpected, elegant, lethal. While the Indian army scrambled to regroup, Alexander advanced with the momentum of a man who already saw victory. And at that moment, the tide turned. But even with the tactical advantage, the battle was far from over. Porus still had his most terrifying card, the war elephants. And how would Alexander deal with these creatures that no war manual had ever taught how to fight? That answer was about to erupt on the battlefield, with fury, fear, and screams drowned out by the sound of trunks and furious hooves. When the first elephants charged, it wasn't just the ground that trembled, it was the very soul of the soldiers. The Macedonians, used to facing cavalry, archers, spears, were unprepared for that living wall of muscle and ivory. They were like mountains in motion, with fierce eyes and a fury honed to crush. The front line once steadfast, wavered. After all, how do you hold formation when the enemy comes with trunks that lift men off the ground as if they were rag dolls? Panic was real. Horses reared, soldiers screamed, and the sight of elephants trampling men and armor looked like a scene straight out of ancient myths. A single stomp was enough to turn a warrior to dust. The Hydaspes, already difficult to cross, now seemed a minor detail compared to the horror raging ahead. Many there thought they were facing not an army, but creatures sent by the gods themselves to test their faith. Even the veterans, hardened by bloody battles, struggled to stay focused. The elephants didn't come alone. They brought along mounted archers, spears attached to their tusks, and enormous shields strapped to their sides. It was like fighting against a moving fortress. And no matter how the Macedonians tried to respond, their strikes seemed futile against that natural armor. Confusion spread like dry fire through straw. Seeing his line waver, Alexander knew he couldn't rely solely on the courage of his men. It was time to think coolly. Yet, there was something mesmerizing about that madness. The way Porus coordinated his attacks, as if dancing with his monsters, was of a sinister elegance. Each elephant seemed to know exactly where to step, where to crush, where to inflict the greatest possible damage. And amid that epic chaos, one question echoed in Alexander the Great's mind. How do you overcome fear? Because the battle of the Hydaspes wasn't just against the enemy, it was against one's own mind. And he knew that if he didn't find a way to break that enchantment of terror, his entire eastern campaign would end right there, under the feet of a giant with gilded tusks. When the dust of panic began to settle, Alexander realized he needed to turn fear into strategy. And that's when the military genius of the man who never surrendered to the impossible shone through. He realized that the elephants weren't invincible, they were controlled. And like any weapon of war, they had a weak point. The mahouts, the handlers of these beasts, were exposed, riding right on top. A difficult target, but not unreachable. With a discreet nod, Alexander unleashed his light cavalry as if releasing a pack of hounds. Quick, agile, precise. The mounted archers and spearmen began flanking the elephants, aiming not at the beasts, but at the men guiding them. It was as if they were cutting the strings of a giant marionette. One by one, the mahouts fell, and then the chaos shifted. Uncontrolled, many elephants panicked, turning against their own Indian allies. Meanwhile, the Macedonian phalanx, that feared wall of spears in the west, held its ground despite the insane pressure of the attacks. The soldiers, who moments before trembled, now roared with anger. They knew they were part of something monumental, a coordinated push here, a strategic opening there, and soon the elephants became entangled among their own bodies and shields. Alexander had disarmed them without destroying them, a lesson in pure field intelligence. The battlefield transformed into a chaotic scene where the elephants, once symbols of order and terror, became lost pieces on a turned-over board. Cries came from every direction, but now there was a different tone, the sound of the reversal. The initiative swung back to Alexander the Great, who watched everything with an expression mixing calculation and instinct. He knew it was time to press. The wall was cracking, and there, amid blood, mud, and wild trunks, Alexander realized he had won more than just a tactic. He had broken fear, and when fear falls, the rest is just execution. Yet even so, the battle still held one final act, a moment that would make Alexander pause, not to attack, but to listen and respect the man who dared face him to the end. Even wounded, bleeding, and with much of his army fallen, Porus did not retreat. He remained mounted on his elephant, proud as if his very pride kept him upright. He was a figure that commanded silence, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Alexander, on the other side, watched in awe. Few men in life have ever shown such dignity in defeat. That Indian king not only fought to the end, he refused to be diminished. even in the face of another's greatness. When Porus was captured, he didn't crawl around as a prisoner. He walked like a king, and Alexander, upon meeting him, did what few conquerors would do. He did not humiliate him. He asked with genuine interest how he wished to be treated, and Porus's answer echoed like a calm thunder. Like a king, a simple, direct phrase that carried the weight of a lifetime of honor. It was as if he said, "You may win the war, but you don't touch my dignity." The impact was immediate. Alexander, who had faced kings and emperors before, was moved by that unbreakable spirit. It was as if he saw in Porus a mirror image of himself, someone who would rather die standing than live on his knees. And instead of punishing him, he did the unexpected. He returned his kingdom, but now under the alliance and protection of the Macedonian Empire. It was more than diplomacy. It was mutual recognition between giants. That moment became legend, a silent lesson that sometimes losing with honor is worth more than winning with arrogance. Alexander understood that conquering lands was one thing. Earning respect was something entirely different. And there, on the banks of the Hydaspes, a bond of mutual respect was forged, one that would transcend history books and echo as an example of leadership and character. But despite the victory and the respect earned, Alexander knew the price of that battle was steep. The elephants, the weather, the terrain, the exhaustion, everything weighed in. And now, a doubt grew in his soldiers' eyes. What else awaited them in the depths of the east? The Hydaspes had been conquered, but would the spirit of the men endure one more step into the unknown? The victory at the Hydaspes was thunderous, yet it was also a turning point, not just on the map. Alexander, the Great, undefeated once again, now faced a question that no enemy had yet managed to impose: the limit of his own army. His men, marked by years of campaigning, looked toward the horizon and saw not glory, but more jungles, more elephants, more endless battles. India seemed to stretch on forever, and the spirit of adventure was giving way to the longing to return. The battle against Porus had been harsh, almost mythical. Many witnessed the abyss up close. Defeating the elephants already seemed like a miracle, but what if the next king had twice as many? Or monsters even worse? What else did India hide in its sacred forests? Alexander, even as he was driven by the will to move forward, began to hear the weary whispers of his generals. For the first time, the maps no longer intimidated. It was sheer exhaustion that was putting an end to the expansion. It's curious, the Hydaspes not only marked the farthest point of Alexander's journey, it also signaled the beginning of his return, the end of the advance. It was as if the universe had said, "That's enough." And Alexander, who always knew how to read the signs, understood. He wasn't defeated by an enemy. He was defeated by human nature, by longing, by exhaustion, by the call of home that shouted louder than any war drum. Even so, the mark was made. The Hydaspes was now part of the legend, the point where Alexander faced the unexpected, conquered the impossible, and chose to listen to his heart. And perhaps that was his greatest victory, not just chasing glory, but knowing when to stop before everything fell apart. Because greatness also lives in sensibility. And now, as the footsteps turned westward, Alexander carried with him something more valuable than land. Stories. Stories that would span centuries. Stories that began with a name, Hydaspes, and echo to this day as a reminder that even the greatest must know when to return. And now I ask you, are you living like Alexander at the peak of your courage? Or are you paralyzed like a soldier facing the first elephant that appears in life? The Battle of the Hydaspes wasn't just an epic chapter in history, it's a mirror. It shows that even the mightiest face unknown monsters, that intelligence is worth more than brute force, and that knowing when to advance or retreat is what separates leaders from the lost. So, what are your war elephants? And what are you doing to cross your own river? Are you waiting for life to run you over? Or are you planning your strategic turnaround like Alexander the Great did at the Hydaspes? If this story has provoked you, inspired you, or at least given you that "damn, I needed to hear this today" moment, then subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Here, we dive deep into history, not to repeat the past, but to understand how it can change our present, because in the end, the real battle is the one you choose to fight right now.